There is a very subtle moment in the awakening process that almost no one immediately recognizes. At the beginning of this journey, everything simply feels slightly different, but difficult to explain. Nothing outside necessarily changes. Life continues unfolding. People keep talking. Days continue passing. But internally, something begins to reorganize. Perhaps you start noticing that many of the thoughts appearing in the mind are not actually chosen by you. They simply appear. A worry arises. A memory surfaces. A judgment forms. And when you observe carefully, something curious becomes clear. These thoughts never ask permission to exist. They simply arise. For most of our lives, we rarely question this. The mind speaks, and we automatically believe it. The mind comments, and we follow the comment. The mind interprets, and we accept the interpretation as reality. But at some point, something begins to shift, perhaps slowly, perhaps almost unnoticed. You begin observing thoughts instead of immediately following them. And when that happens, a small distance begins to appear, a very subtle distance, but an incredibly important one, because for the first time, you begin to see that something in you is capable of observing thoughts, and that which observes is not the thought. This small recognition changes the way the mind operates. Before, thoughts appeared to be the center of experience. Now they begin to look more like movements within experience, like clouds moving across the sky, like waves forming on the surface of water. They appear, they remain for a moment, and then they disappear. As this perception becomes clearer, something interesting begins to happen. The silence between thoughts becomes slightly more noticeable, not because thoughts have vanished, but because you are no longer completely lost within them. And within that small space of silence, something new begins to emerge. Something that does not come from the mind. Something that does not appear to be created by thinking. At first it is only a subtle sensation, almost like a different form of intelligence. A quiet perception, an inner inclination, a direction that does not require words. Perhaps you have already felt this in simple moments of life. You are facing a choice. Maybe something small, something ordinary. The mind immediately begins analyzing. It presents arguments, it creates scenarios, it calculates possibilities, it attempts to predict the future. But at the same time, there is something very quiet inside you that already seems to know which direction is aligned. And this sensation does not come with explanations. It does not try to convince you. It does not argue with the mind. It simply exists. Very simple, very quiet, very clear. And interestingly, when you begin following this silent sense of knowing, something starts to change in the way life unfolds. Decisions feel more natural, paths seem more fluid. Situations begin organizing themselves in unexpected ways. Not because you suddenly control everything, but because there is a feeling of alignment. For a long time, most people completely ignore this type of perception because we were trained to rely almost exclusively on the mind. Logic, analysis, prediction. If something cannot be quickly explained, the mind tends to dismiss it. But awakening begins to reveal something surprising. The mind was never the only form of intelligence within us. There is another type of intelligence, an intelligence that does not think, an intelligence that perceives. It does not construct arguments, it recognizes. It does not calculate possibilities. It simply senses when something is aligned, and when it is not. At first, this perception appears only in small moments, small decisions, small impulses, small inner signals. But if you begin observing carefully, something interesting begins to reveal itself. This quiet guidance almost always points toward something more authentic, something simpler, something more true, while the mind often points toward what appears safer, more familiar, more socially acceptable. This happens because the mind was conditioned. It learned from the past. It tries to protect you by repeating known patterns. But inner guidance does not come from the past. It does not depend on memory. It does not depend on conditioning. It arises directly from the present moment, and that is why it feels so different. The mind speaks loudly. The mind creates stories. The mind creates worries. But inner guidance speaks quietly. So quietly that for most of our lives it goes unnoticed. For years, for decades, it was always there. But the constant noise of thought prevented us from recognizing it. Until something changes. Until one day you begin to notice. And in that moment, a new way of living begins to reveal itself. You begin to see that perhaps your life was never truly guided only by the mind. Perhaps something deeper has always been present. Something quieter, something more fundamental, something that has always been pointing in a direction. But there is something even more interesting about this inner guidance, something many people only realize much later. This guidance does not suddenly appear. It does not arise because you achieved some special state. In truth, it was always present. What changes is not its presence. What changes is your ability to hear it. And that shift happens when the mind begins to slow down, when thoughts stop occupying the entire space of consciousness, when a small space of silence appears. Within that space, something reveals itself, something that was always there waiting quietly. And when you begin to recognize this, a profound question inevitably appears. If this guidance has always been present, why do most people go through their entire lives without noticing it? The answer to that question reveals something fundamental about the nature of the human mind, something that becomes clear when we begin observing how thoughts truly operate. And when you start observing this carefully, something very interesting begins to happen. Because the quieter the mind becomes, the clearer this silent guidance appears. And when that happens, the way you make decisions begins to change completely. But to truly understand how this inner guidance becomes clear, we must first observe something even more fundamental, something that is happening inside the mind all the time, yet rarely noticed. And this is precisely where the journey begins to deepen. When this quiet perception begins appearing more frequently, something interesting starts happening within the field of consciousness. You begin to notice that two different movements seem to exist within you at the same time. On one side there is the mind. The mind continues functioning exactly as it always has. It keeps analyzing, it keeps trying to predict the future, it keeps attempting to control what might happen. This is the natural function of the mind. It evolved precisely for this purpose. For thousands of years, this mechanism helped human beings survive. The mind identifies danger, the mind creates strategies, the mind projects possible scenarios. This type of functioning is extremely useful when dealing with practical aspects of life. But when it comes to the deeper direction of life, the mind does not have the same clarity. Because the mind always operates from the past, everything the mind knows comes from memory, previous experiences, accumulated knowledge, patterns repeated over time. The mind looks at the past and tries to project the future. But inner guidance operates in a completely different way. It does not come from memory. It does not come from the past. It arises directly from the present moment. And that is why it often feels so unfamiliar to the mind. Because it does not follow familiar logic, it does not offer guarantees, it does not present detailed arguments, it simply points. And this difference creates a very interesting phenomenon within consciousness. The mind wants certainty, inner guidance offers direction. The mind wants control, inner guidance offers alignment. The mind wants safety, inner guidance offers truth. At first, these two forces may appear to conflict with each other. You feel a quiet direction within, but the mind immediately begins questioning it. It asks, what if this goes wrong? What if I am mistaken? What if I miss an opportunity? What if this is not the right choice? These questions may seem reasonable, and often they are. But if you observe carefully, something important becomes clear. The mind is not actually searching for truth. It is trying to avoid risk. It is trying to keep everything within familiar territory, because the unknown feels dangerous to the mind. Yet inner guidance almost always points toward the unknown, not because it seeks difficulties, but because life itself does not move from the past. Life moves from the present, and the present is always unknown. That is why when someone begins living more from awareness rather than from the mind, something interesting begins to unfold. Decisions are no longer based purely on fear or prediction. They begin to arise from a direct perception of the moment, and this perception has a very different quality than thought. It is incredibly simple. The mind complicates. Inner guidance simplifies. The mind creates many options. Inner guidance reveals a quiet direction. The mind creates debate. Inner guidance brings clarity. But this clarity does not arrive loudly. It appears as quietness, as a feeling of alignment, as if something within gently says, this path is in harmony, even if the mind still has doubts, even if the outcome is unknown, even if logic cannot fully explain it. And it is exactly at this point that many people begin to notice something curious. When we follow only the mind, life often feels filled with effort. Decisions feel heavy, paths feel forced. But when we begin trusting this silent guidance, something shifts. It does not mean that challenges disappear. Life continues, bringing unexpected situations. Moments of uncertainty still appear, but something important changes. There is a sense of coherence, a feeling that decisions are aligned with something deeper. And when that alignment exists, even challenges begin to feel different. They no longer appear as random obstacles. They begin to look like part of a larger movement of life itself. But there is one important detail many people do not notice at first. Inner guidance does not function like a complete map. It does not show the entire path. It does not reveal the future. It only reveals the next step. and often that step appears extremely simple. A small decision, a subtle shift in direction, but when that small step is followed, something interesting happens. The next step becomes visible, then another, and another, as if life itself begins revealing its movement gradually. But this only happens when there is enough trust to follow what appears in the moment, and that trust does not appear suddenly, it grows slowly. It grows through experience. Each time you follow this quiet guidance, and notice how life naturally organizes itself, trust grows a little more, and slowly, the relationship with the mind begins to change. The mind is no longer the only authority. It remains useful, it remains a valuable tool, but it is no longer in control. Now something deeper begins guiding the movement of life. Something quieter, something more stable, something that does not depend on thoughts to exist, but to truly recognize inner guidance. Something even more fundamental must be understood, because the mind does not only question this guidance, it often tries to imitate it. It produces thoughts that appear to be intuition, ideas that appear to be guidance, and learning to distinguish between these two is one of the most important aspects of awakening, because when that distinction becomes clear, something extraordinary begins to happen. Life begins moving with far more clarity, more simplicity, more alignment. But before we explore how to recognize this difference, we must first look at something even deeper, something that is happening inside the mind all the time, yet rarely noticed. And when that becomes clear, inner guidance stops feeling mysterious. It becomes natural, something always present, something that has always been guiding you, quietly. When we begin observing the movement of the mind more carefully, something very interesting starts revealing itself. For a long time, we assume that every impulse arising within us comes from the same place. A thought appears, and we believe it. An idea emerges, and we assume it represents our own decision. An emotion arises, and we react automatically. But when awareness begins awakening, something changes in this dynamic. You begin noticing that not everything appearing inside the mind comes from the same source. Some thoughts feel chaotic. They appear rapidly. They change direction. They create imaginary scenarios, concerns, stories about the future, stories about the past. These thoughts carry a particular kind of energy. They are fast. They are repetitive. They create urgency. They try to convince you. They try to push you into making a decision immediately. This is the typical movement of the conditioned mind. It operates through repetition. It reproduces learned patterns. It attempts to protect you by avoiding what appears unknown. But when you begin observing more carefully, something curious becomes clear. There is another kind of perception appearing within consciousness. This perception does not rush. It does not create urgency. It does not try to convince you. It does not construct complex arguments. It simply appears as a quiet clarity, a direct perception, a form of knowing that does not depend on thought. Many people describe this experience as an inner voice, but most of the time it does not appear as a literal voice. Instead, it appears as a sense of alignment, an inner feeling that something is in harmony, even while the mind still has doubts. This difference is extremely important, because learning to distinguish these two movements inside consciousness completely transforms the way we live. The mind speaks loudly. Inner guidance speaks quietly. The mind creates fear. Inner guidance creates clarity. The mind creates pressure. Inner guidance creates direction. When someone begins recognizing this difference, something interesting happens. The relationship with thoughts begins to change. Before, every thought felt like a command. Now it begins to look like a movement within the mind. Something that can be observed. Something that can be questioned. Something that can simply pass. This recognition creates space, and within that space, inner guidance becomes increasingly perceptible. At first it appears only in specific moments, perhaps during silence, perhaps while walking, perhaps while observing nature, perhaps when the mind finally slows down for a moment, and in those moments something interesting happens. Clarity appears, not as a logical conclusion but as a simple perception, a perception that does not require explanation, a perception that feels natural. This type of clarity carries a very different quality than the mind. It does not create inner conflict. It does not generate debate. It does not produce anxiety. It simply presents itself as something obvious. And when you begin trusting this perception a little more, something starts changing in the way life unfolds. Decisions begin emerging from a quieter place. The movements of life begin to feel more coherent. Situations begin aligning in unexpected ways. Not because you suddenly control everything, but because you begin moving in harmony with something deeper. Yet there is an important detail in this process. At first, the mind tries to interfere. It tries to interpret the guidance. It tries to convert it into thought. It tries to take control again. That is why many people feel confused, because the mind begins producing thoughts that resemble intuition, thoughts that resemble guidance. But there is a very clear difference when you observe carefully. Thoughts from the mind often generate tension. They produce anxiety. They create urgency. They create fear of making the wrong choice. Inner guidance feels different. It creates calm. It creates space. It creates a sense of simplicity, even when the path seems unknown, even when the outcome remains unclear. This quiet clarity does not arrive with fear. It arrives with presence. And the more someone begins living in presence, the easier it becomes to recognize this difference. The mind continues functioning. It continues producing thoughts. It continues creating interpretations. But now something new exists. Now there is awareness. And when awareness is present, something fundamental changes. You no longer need to follow every thought that appears. You can observe, you can wait, you can feel. And within that space of observation, inner guidance begins revealing itself with far greater clarity. But something even deeper is happening within this process. Because when you begin trusting this guidance, something curious begins happening around you. Reality itself seems to respond differently. Unexpected situations appear. Encounters happen at the right moment. Answers appear when needed. Many people describe these moments as coincidences, others call them synchronicities. But when we observe carefully, something interesting becomes evident. Perhaps these moments are not merely coincidences. Perhaps they reveal a much deeper relationship between consciousness and reality. And when this relationship begins becoming clear, something extraordinary begins unfolding. Life no longer appears as a random sequence of events. It begins to feel like a living movement, a flow, an intelligent process constantly unfolding. But to fully understand this, we must look even deeper into the nature of consciousness itself. Because when inner guidance begins guiding your decisions, something changes not only within you, something begins changing in the way reality organizes itself. And this is exactly what begins to appear when awareness becomes more stable. But before we understand how reality begins responding to this new state of consciousness, something even more fundamental must be seen, something that transforms the way we perceive the relationship between mind, awareness, and life itself. And that is exactly what we will explore next. When this inner guidance begins becoming clearer within the experience of awareness, something very interesting begins to unfold. At first, the shift is almost imperceptible. Nothing dramatic happens. There is no sudden revelation. There is no spectacular moment where everything becomes perfectly clear. Most of the time, the change is quiet, subtle, but deeply transformative. Before, thoughts seemed to guide every movement of your life. Every decision appeared to arise from the mind. Every choice required long internal debates. The mind analyzed possibilities, compared scenarios, tried to predict the future, tried to prevent mistakes. But when inner guidance begins becoming visible, something begins to change in this dynamic. Thoughts still exist. The mind continues functioning, but it no longer feels like the center of experience. Before, the mind appeared to be the authority. Now it begins to look more like a tool, a useful tool, a powerful tool, but still, only a tool. And when this becomes clear, something very interesting happens inside awareness. Decisions begin arising from a different place, a quieter place, a place where there is less conflict, a place where perception feels more direct. This perception does not come with arguments. It does not arrive as a long explanation. It appears as a simple sense of alignment, as if something within you recognizes the direction that is in harmony with the present moment. And this sensation is often surprisingly calm. It does not create urgency. It does not create fear. It does not create pressure. It simply points. And when you begin trusting this perception a little more, something begins to change in the way life unfolds. Before, every decision felt heavy. It felt like any choice could drastically change the future. It felt like you needed to calculate every detail. But when inner guidance begins guiding the movement of life, something becomes lighter, not because life becomes easy, but because the sense of struggling against life begins to fade. You begin to realize that perhaps life does not need to be controlled in the way the mind always tried. For a long time we believed life needed to be managed like a project, every step planned, every path calculated, every outcome predicted. But life does not truly function that way. Life moves, it transforms, it constantly responds to the present moment. And when we try controlling every detail, we often create more tension than clarity. Inner guidance works in a completely different way. It does not attempt to dominate the flow of life. It moves with it. It perceives the moment. It senses the movement of the situation. And from that perception, it responds. This response does not come from memory, it does not come from the past, it does not come from conditioning. It arises directly from awareness, and this reveals something profoundly interesting. Perhaps the mind was never the true guide of life. Perhaps the mind was always only an instrument of interpretation, while awareness itself was always the space of perception. And when someone begins living from that awareness, something interesting happens. Choices begin emerging with greater simplicity. The direction of life begins to feel more natural. Even difficult moments start being perceived differently. Before, every challenge appeared as a personal problem, something that needed immediate resolution, something that threatened stability. But when awareness becomes more stable, perception changes. Challenges still exist. Uncertainty still appears. But now there is space, observation, presence, and within that space, something very interesting begins to reveal itself. You begin noticing that life itself seems to respond to the way consciousness moves. When there is tension, experience becomes confused. When there is presence, something begins aligning. Situations organize themselves in unexpected ways. Encounters happen at the right moment. Information appears when needed. Answers arrive naturally. Some people call these moments coincidence. Others call them synchronicity. But when we observe carefully, something deeper begins to appear. Perhaps these events are not simply random. Perhaps they reveal a much deeper relationship between consciousness and reality. Perhaps the way we perceive the world influences what reveals itself within experience. And when this possibility becomes visible, something profound changes. Life no longer appears as a random sequence of events. It begins to look like a living process, a flow, a continuous movement of intelligence, as if reality itself were responding to the way consciousness moves. And when this perception deepens, an inevitable question arises. Does reality truly respond to the state of our consciousness? Could what appears in experience be connected to how we perceive and move within life? This question is ancient. It appears in many spiritual traditions, but it also becomes very clear when someone begins living in presence, rather than inside the mind. Because when the mind stops dominating the entire experience, something new becomes visible. The relationship between consciousness and reality, a dynamic relationship, a living relationship, one that may have always been present, yet rarely noticed. And when this perception becomes clearer, something fascinating happens. Life itself begins to feel like a form of communication, as if reality were responding to the state of consciousness. But understanding this relationship fully requires deeper observation, because when inner guidance begins guiding your decisions, something begins changing not only within you, something begins changing in the way reality organizes itself around you. And that is exactly what we will begin exploring in the next video. Gratitude for being here. Much light on your path. Quantum Silence.